Welcome to the Q Mind Body podcast. My name is Darren Main. And in this podcast, we talk about all things having to do with mind body wellness for gay men. And I'm doing this in partnership with the Gay Wellness website. So if you're looking for any support, whether it's a massage therapist or a yoga teacher, a coach, a psychotherapist, or just about anything else, check out the directory because it's amazing. In this episode, we're going to be talking about gay men and mental health, which is a huge challenge for our community. And I have Jerry Givens with me. He's a coach and an author and a yoga teacher. You will always wear that hat, my friend, even if you're not actively teaching. And he does work both in a corporate and personal setting, doing all of those. And I probably forgot some of your titles because you have so many. Before we dive in, I will put links in the show notes to all of the resources we discuss, as well as Jerry's contact information and website. His website is jerrygivens.net, where you can learn more about all of his work. And I will put links to all of my information as well, so you can learn about my coaching work, massage therapy, and yoga. Finally, we have a Facebook group that you can join, and I hope you will, where you can continue the conversation, ask questions, watch past videos and interviews, and get informed about future in-person and local support group events that we will have planned. All of that said, let's start. Jerry, how are you?
I'm doing well today. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm doing awesome. You know, I cannot listen to Alanis Morissette without thinking of you. You are
Oh no.
like You're just like Alanis Morissette, Jerry. You're right
They're,
there.
they're, they're synonymous for
Yeah,
most friends of mine, my name and Alanis Morissette, which is
yeah,
interesting because in addition to her wonderful, wonderful music, she's also taught me a great deal about actually one of the topics for today, which is actually mental health. Um,
yeah.
in all of my trainings with yoga, meditation, mindfulness, and also mental health, I proudly have been on some mental health retreats with Alanis Morissette, where she was one of the facilitators. And so I've actually got
Wow.
to study with her, if you will, around things like mental health, connection to
Yeah.
spirit, and also working through trauma and grief.
Well, one of the things I appreciate about her is that she is her music for sure, but then just the way she is and moves through the world is she's so raw and unapologetic, both in her beautiful, polished self, but also in the messy. I heard her speaking on postpartum depression
Yeah.
and really doing this deep dive into how dark a hole it can be and not being ashamed, just like this is a thing that happens where
Mhm.
people need support and we should just talk about it and not be afraid of it. And so
Definitely.
I'm glad she's inspiring you. um well, let's talk about gay men and our mental health challenges, because I think one of the ways gay men have coped over the years, and every decade seems to be a different challenge for our community, is to be light and funny and buoyant and happy all the time. Even the
Mhm.
word gay means happy. And it is good to be those things. Those are good qualities that we have. But I think they can also be a mask when things aren't that way and we feel a need to pretend and always be on. And so I'm wondering what your top level observations are of that dynamic that is so prevalent in our community.
Yeah. So, what I hear you talking about, aside from the wonderful people that we all are, and I do believe that in my whole heart for each one of us, is that we have this desire, need, impulse, or even trauma response to perform who we are sometimes. And sometimes that's normal. Like if we're saying we're like at work or we're trying to be supportive to a friend, we might need to like push our stuff down so that we can show up in a way that is contextually appropriate to the situation. But the problem comes when we spend time in that performative stage and we're using that to push down whatever feelings we're not dealing with in that moment, which could be a wide range of feelings from insecurities to shame to just being uncomfortable in the setting that we're in, fear. There's fill in the blank here. There's so much that we could be pushing down through trying to project an air of 100% happiness, being jubilant all the time. And while it's great to do that, it's great to be happy, it's great to find people you can feel safe with where you can do that. It's also important to make sure that we take care of the feelings that are not in the happy bucket, you know? And I think that
Yeah.
might even branch a little bit further than just gay men's mental health, but there's this idea, especially in our like American culture, that there are certain emotions that just are not acceptable. And so some of
Yeah.
those emotions, we can see this especially in social justice work, some of those emotions are anger, being angry about something. And as gay men in this country, if not this world, we actually do have things that we need to be angry about personally and systemically. Some
Yeah.
other feelings that are not acceptable in our culture are sadness, guilt, expressing shame, um, among other ones I'm sure we can think of, but
Yeah.
those are the ones that stick out to me first. And so this need to perform happiness that might not be
Yeah.
necessarily genuine goes to covering up the bad emotions, but there's also this non acceptance in culture to
Yeah.
actually feel those out loud.
I have been musing on this, and I would love your insight. Um, there was a sort of a huge moment in sort of our quest for equal rights where the DSM, which psychology professionals use to diagnose mental illness, took being homosexual out, and I think they left in like conflicts around your sexuality, but the idea that you're gay or straight or bi or whatever got removed, and that was a
Mhm.
huge good thing. And yet, I think that impression, especially among some and in some communities in the United States and elsewhere, that impression that it's a mental health thing, that you're sick, that you're not mentally well, that you're a pervert, that there's something wrong with you,
Yeah.
sort of stuck. And I
Hmm.
think we go out of our way to try to prove that that's not the case. No, I'm not. I'm perfectly well. I'm perfectly healthy. I'm perfectly happy. And you're not sick because you're gay, but that doesn't mean you can't have other mental health challenges. And we have I think, especially right now, we have difficulty having two things be true at the same time in on many different issues.
Yeah.
That you can love your father even if he votes differently than you, right? You can not like the way he votes, and you can love him. And I think mental health is like that. And I'm wondering
Definitely.
if you have any thoughts about that dynamic and how that might be a difficult needle to thread.
Yeah, I think we're taught systemically that there is one true right and one true wrong, and that we have to be as right as possible in order to be loved, worthy, perfect, insert, great qualification here. And something that I've been working actually recently with, it's funny that you are musing on this lately. I've been working with my mental health clients on is around this idea that there is inherent paradox in our bodies and our systems, but also in the world. Two things, as you said, two things can be true at the same time. And also somebody else's truth can be different than yours, and nobody has to be wrong. That's a hard pill
Yeah.
to swallow when you've been fighting, for many of us, our entire lives to be validated by our culture, to be seen as not sick. That was like 1973 when that was removed from the DSM. And, here we are 40 something years later, 50 something years later. And, it's still a stigma that's trying to be overcome. And we've come a long way, but there's so much further to go around that. But really understanding that paradoxes can exist culturally, societally, and also inside of our systems. We can internally feel like there are two conflicting things that are true. And how do
Yeah.
we deal with that? That I think that's part of the mental
Yeah.
health journey is being able to be okay with two things being true or more than two things being true.
Yeah. when we were talking before we went live, I was thinking about this, how there's the external work that we all need to do as a community, where we have pride parades and we vote according to our interests, and we
Yeah.
we advocate for ourselves and all of that external stuff that's so important. But it, it's almost like we can get lost in that, as opposed to the inner work, which is the internalized homophobia and depression and shame and stuff that we is sort of a little too close to home and hard to look at. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering
Yeah.
how you advise the men you work with, on how to sit with whatever they're struggling with,
Yeah.
shame, guilt, whatever. And how do you support them in sitting with that and find the courage to do so? Because we can change all the laws in the world, but if you're not content within, it's you're still in a prison of your own making.
So true. So true. I wish there was one answer, but a couple of answers come to mind. First is to understand what you just talked about. Sometimes we spend so much time externalizing our effort to be well that we forget to forget to deal with the internal, to take care of the internal. And so sometimes when I'm talking, especially like in a corporate context, about mental health, I break it down this way. We have our individual needs. And if you've looked at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's really what I'm talking about. There are these certain needs that we have to have fulfilled, or we need to have fulfilled in order to feel good in the world. And they go from everything from the base needs like food, shelter, water, safety, all the way to the top of the pyramid, which is self actualization. So everything in between, relationality, all of that. And adverse mental health happens when your needs do not align with internal and external constraints. And so what you were talking about is the external constraints, voting in a specific way, having pride parades, speaking up when you see injustices. But we do forget to take care of those internal constraints, which are the limiting beliefs that we took on from our culture or from our families, trauma that we've experienced, either firsthand, secondhand, or collectively. And this is where we get into things like internalized homophobia and then any other issues that might be latent that are more about what's happening inside of our minds. And so just to kind of define those internal constraints or what we're talking about here. So what I do with my clients and when I'm teaching about mental health to other people, first thing, it actually comes from the realm of mindfulness, which you and I are both well versed in, which is compassion and non-judgment. I truly believe that there are no bad parts of us. That every single part of you, every single part of me, every single part of every single person, and as much as I bias as I believe that to be true, every single part of every person is good. The problem comes when these different parts of ourselves entertain extreme roles, when they really cling to a belief that is limiting, that goes against an internal need for validation or safety or some other need that we have. And so, one of the first things I try to work with my clients on is I become the projection of unconditional positive regard. You could tell me you killed somebody, and my first thought is going to be, okay, tell me what happened. Like, let's like explore that a little bit here. Not condoning any actions that happened, of course, but sitting with it from a compassionate place, because there's so much judgment, so much shame, so much finger pointing, and it does go back to systemic things like in the queer community, gay community, being a homosexual, being classified as a psychological disorder. It goes back to that. Like we believe something's wrong. And so my first job as somebody holding space for anyone, let alone one of my clients, is just to hold compassionate, positive regard for them. And then from there, even if they're not able to hold themselves compassionately, just keep projecting and reflecting that back to them. And
Yeah.
one things that we've talked
I
about a little bit is
yeah.
like isolation and depression, and like those are really uncomfortable feelings to be with. And so just allowing those topics to come up with that sense of compassion and safety.
I always tell, when I'm training yoga teachers, I always say the job of a yoga teacher is not the alignment, the sequencing. Those are important tools we have, but rather to see in your students the potential that they can't yet see in themselves. And I think when we work with anyone, seeing a potential where people are healed, where they're whole, whether it's in their body or their heart, their mind. And you are really, really good at that. I mean, even as a friend, like when we've hung out and sat and had coffee or tea, you're really, really exceptional at holding that space. So I want to really appreciate that about you.
Thank you.
Um, so I this question is, I mean, maybe there isn't a simple answer for this, but I think there is. I would put mental health loosely as a layperson into two categories. One is the kind where self help practices like meditation, yoga, journaling, all these things
Mhm.
that we can do, going to a support group, maybe working with a coach, a life coach to strategize your life a little bit better, to make better choices. And
Mhm.
then there's the kind where you need treatment, you need a psychiatric professional. And I'm wondering um, how you help people to, because I think just identifying what you are, I mean, as a yoga teacher and as a coach and as a massage therapist for that matter, I have a lot of people that come to me because they don't trust the establishment. They want the alternative. And I'm like, I feel your pain and you really need to see a doctor or a psychiatrist for this. I'm wondering how you help people navigate that and decide which is the most appropriate path for me, because might not be able to see it clearly themselves.
Yeah, most people aren't able to see it clearly themselves, to your point. And not to devalue any yoga teacher in the world, because I am one myself, as you said. But there's a question, it's like, why are you going to your yoga teacher about mental health issues? You can find a lot of support there, meditation, groundedness, nervous system regulation techniques. There's actually a lot to be said there for that. But if that question's coming up, usually it's because people feel like there's something bigger going on. And to your point, they don't feel comfortable going to someone else. And so my first job is not to try to convince them of anything and to stay within my realm of knowledge. Like, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a licensed clinical therapist. I work with mental health in the realm that I can. Um, and again, that unconditional positive regard, they might have really good reasons why they don't trust the established treatment resources like inpatient treatment, psychiatric services, or even licensed therapists. Especially like for me working in mental health, what I do is quite close to therapy. It's not the same thing, but it's quite close. And I know, and there are people, therapists themselves, who come and see me because I'm not a therapist, because it feels safer to work with a coach versus a therapist. And so
Yeah.
getting curious with them about that. Now, inevitably, over time, if I do acknowledge that there might be, let's say, like a mood disorder that's present, like a psychiatric disorder that might need medication, my go to, and maybe this is a little bit bypassing, is to refer them back to their primary care physician. Like, I'm not a doctor. I'm not somebody who can diagnose them. I'm not somebody who can help them from that perspective, but I can definitely help open their mind to the possibility. It's like, well, why are you afraid of working with a psychiatrist? Oh, your parents
Yeah.
put you on medication for ADD when you were 9 years old, and it numbed you out to your entire adolescent experience. And so you felt isolated, you felt shut down, and you felt ingenuine your entire life. Okay, that makes sense why you would be adverse to maybe going on medication or being in,
Yeah.
traditional therapy. Like, really getting curious with them is my first route there.
um, I'd like to bring this into something that is not uniquely gay men, but I think more prevalent for gay men than with our straight cohorts. Maybe. I don't know. I don't. Um, I think the possibility. I think when people are struggling with their mental health, um, we tend to find ways to self medicate that are not necessarily healthy. Obviously,
Yeah.
drinking too much, using drugs. But I think gay men, our sexuality can be a form of self medication. And I don't want to slut shame. I think if you have a healthy, vigorous sex life that includes multiple partners
Hmm.
and it's ethical and conscious and intentional. I support you in that, and here's my number. No, just kidding. No, but there are times when, and I think all of us have felt this, where we do things that are not lifting us up,
Yeah.
and maybe just an escape from looking at what's just under the surface. So I'm wondering, as you work with gay men specifically, I'm wondering how you help navigate that, like empowering people to be sexual and free and all the things that are great about being a gay man, but also helping them to look at some of the areas where maybe you might want to take a look here.
Yeah. My yoga teacher said one time, you can do anything you want, just know why you're doing it. And so with my gay male clients, when it comes to coping mechanisms, because that's really what we're talking about here, using drugs, alcohol, sex, and there's more to than just those options out there, is to get curious about like, well, why are you doing that? Like, what are you trying to run from or towards? And we joked about like we're not slut shaming anybody here, and like that's exactly it. It's like there's so much shame that's wrapped around some of these coping mechanisms that have been readily available to gay men over the decades in modern times that we have used to numb pain, right? And so it's not to tell them to like stop, like abstinence doesn't work. We know that. It might work for some people. Let me backtrack on that a little bit. But generally speaking, if you remove a coping mechanism, you have to replace it with something else or you have to heal it, or else you're just going to find yourself in another negative habit. And so it's like, have as much sex as you need or want right now while we're figuring this out. But
Yeah,
let's try to look at what's underneath it. It's like, what is making you at 11:30 at night when you're at home alone go on Grinder and find somebody nearby to hook up with? Is it because you're just
yeah,
horny and you just want to get off? Great, good. If you're empowered around that, please go do it. If it doesn't hurt you or somebody else, go do it. But if you're doing
yeah,
it to cover up like extreme loneliness or to mask depression or to give yourself a dopamine hit because you really haven't had one in a few hours, that's when I would start to ask the question, okay, like, well, what
mm,
is behind the action there, right?
yeah,
um I would say I'm trying to think of like actual case studies that I have from my clients. It's actually the inverse of that has been true with one of my clients, where instead of going out and seeking something, he just shuts down and isolates even more. And so he starts to feel
yeah,
uncomfortable and he just starts shutting out the world, which is actually a form of dissociation, which is also, in this case, an unhealthy coping mechanism. And it makes
yeah,
him less connected to his community, less connected to his identity as a gay man, and deepens the wounds around the depression and the isolation. Um,
yeah,
but it gets him relief because he just shuts himself down or he distracts himself with something else, and that can lead to other things like
yeah,
overeating from a trauma response perspective. uh, Again, like the social isolation, that's a big one for this specific person.
yeah. Um, we could talk about so many different topics here. I want to touch on one more thing, and then I would
Yeah,
love to invite you back on to continue this conversation and maybe nuance even further into very specific things because I love chatting with you. Every time I chat with you, you
it's wonderful.
we either talk about Alanis Morissette or something really cool and meaningful.
It's sometimes
Um,
both.
Same, yeah. I mean, she was God after all in the movie Dogma, so.
She was, and in my opinion still is, but yeah.
um, I was sharing this with you before we started recording, and I'm going to leave out a lot of the details because it's someone else's story. But I have a 14-year-old son, and one of his friends just had his 14th birthday, and we went, and the birthday party was not just his birthday, but also his coming out party, thrown by
Mm,
his parents. Um,
congratulations.
and yeah, I was in tears reading the invitation because it's like that is so the opposite of what it was like. Well, at 14, there's no way I would have come out. I would have been killed, literally.
Quite literally,
Um,
yeah.
so I guess it got me thinking, like, how have you noticed a difference? I mean, every generation has its challenges. I mean, that generation lived through the pandemic, so
Yeah,
I'm sure they're going to have a lot of stuff around that. But I mean, I think the difference between I'm 53, and being a 53-year-old gay man versus a 70-year-old gay man versus a 20-year-old gay man versus the 14-year-old who's just coming out and having a cool birthday party with rainbow flags everywhere. Um, I'm wondering how you see the generational aspect of mental health and wellness for gay men, because I suspect it is different.
it's so different.
The kids today don't, or even people under the age of 40 don't really, they know what the AIDS crisis was, but they didn't live through it. They didn't watch half their
Yeah.
friends die. So that tends to change you when you see that happen. So I'm
Oh,
wondering if
definitely.
you could just reflect on the generational aspect of being a gay man with mental health.
Yeah, so I definitely see a difference. Almost to the point where if you were to give me like a sheet of paper that just gave me somebody's case study without giving me their age, I could probably place them in, millennial, Gen X, Boomer, uh, Silent Generation, Gen Z, Alpha, whatever the generations are, as we're calling them these days. But it is, to your point, probably around their lived experiences, right? And so for people who lived through the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, and especially experienced the neglect from not just culture, but from government, they have a specific relationship to their identity that's different because of what they've experienced and maybe have a different attitude towards it. I'm 39, so I'm like an elder millennial, whatever that means. um, and so, like, I was aware of the AIDS crisis, but I was way too young to really integrate it at that age. But me coming out in the early 2000s, I didn't come out at 14 either. It was much later. But like that, the stigma around being queer, being gay, and AIDS being a threat. It's before PrEP. It's before a lot of the interventions that are available now were not available back then. Like, not only did coming out feel like it was scary, it also felt like it was life threatening. And not just because
Yeah,
somebody's going to kill me or beat me up, a bit like the inevitable track that I'm told by culture, TV, my parents,
yeah.
what I've seen from other people explaining it is like, you'll come out, you'll have gay sex, and you'll die. Like that was what we were taught without any
So
context about
affirming.
how to. So affirming. And so I bring that up not just to express my experience, but just to name that when we go through collective trauma, like the pandemic, like the AIDS
Mm.
crisis, or being the generation after those experiences, we are kind of shaped and molded in our mental health capacities or what we believe to be true. We talked about those internal constraints earlier, rubbing up against your actual needs. We take on and in psychology, we call these legacy burdens or cultural burdens. We take on this messaging, this conditioning from the culture around us. And so when that's imprinted, definitely impacts the generational differences.
Yeah.
Just like, our grandparents' generations being gay was a psychological disorder, or it was just something like if you were found out, you lost everything. I've been watching
Yeah.
some fictional movies where the story takes place like in the 40s and 50s, like in old Hollywood, and these actors who had to remain in the closet and sometimes even have like
Mm.
fake or lavender marriages because if they didn't, they would literally lose their livelihoods and could even be killed.
Did you ever see the Celluloid Closet?
No,
It's a
no.
documentary about that subject, about as Hollywood was becoming Hollywood, how like so many of these actors were gay and lesbian, and
So
they were very out within that community, but it was this whole, it was almost like you were playing two roles. There was the role on the silver screen, and then the sort of the Rock Hudson role of like this
yeah,
ladies man who was really gay and
very gay.
ultimately died of AIDS.
Yeah,
It's a interesting exploration, and how terrifying it was during the McCarthyism, how they were targeting Hollywood and gay men in particular
yeah. And
for
these
being
experiences,
communist and gay.
Exactly. The communism term.
Yeah,
Yeah, and all these experiences that we have collectively, especially when we break it down to generations, means that gay men from different generations are going to show up with different imprints. You know, if you lived through the AIDS crisis, probably above the age of 14, you had a specific imprint of your identity around a real threatening outcome. You know, it's
yeah,
like the pandemic, but like it felt like it was only affecting gay people, right? Like if COVID could
yeah,
only kill gay people. Um, and so like when I work with like clients from that generation, I have to be sensitive to that, sensitive to their lived
yeah,
experience. I can't assume anything because of my experience as a millennial who didn't live through that from a frontal lobe perspective. Um,
yeah,
that I can't assume anything about their experience in the same way that if I worked with like a 14-year-old, bless him, who's coming out of the closet, is going to have a very different
yeah,
experience of his identity as a gay person than somebody 40, 50, 60 years ago, or
yeah.
even 20 years ago.
Well, we have much more to talk about, my
So
friend,
much more.
um, both with the camera on and with the camera off. I suspect the camera off, the conversation will go to toilet humor in a hurry. So, um, so jerrygivens.net. I will put links to all of your information in the show notes so people can get in touch with you, learn more about your coaching work and other things you have going on. I will also put links to my information. My website is darrenmain.com. I encourage you to join our Facebook group so you can continue the conversation and contribute to the conversation. And check out some of the amazing healers on the Gay Wellness website. Or if you are a healer of some sort yourself, you should definitely list. I have met some of my favorite massage and coaching clients through that website. So I'm really thrilled that it's out there. Finally, one last thing, if you're having any mental health crisis or challenge, be sure to reach out for some help. There's a national suicide hotline, and you can, of course, speak to your physician if you need that. Jerry, did I miss anything?
Nope, I think everything sounds great. There's so many great organizations out there for gay men's mental health. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
I think you named the places to go to get in touch with those organizations
yeah,
too if you need support.
awesome. Jerry, I will see you soon, and I hope you will all like, subscribe, and share this podcast, and I will see you in the next episode.